as a world, as a species, we've been very off kilter, incredibly off balance between the masculine and feminine energies that, as you say, course through everything, through all of creation, because much to the surprise of some humans, we're part of the cosmos. So guess what? Those balanced energies go through all of us in the same way that they go through all of creation. We only get into trouble with them because we suppress the feminine. We've turned the feminine into something lesser, something weaker, which it absolutely is not. If you want to talk power, you want to talk resilience, courage, let's talk about the power of creation that resides in a female body.
Welcome to the Cosmic Love Antenna Podcast. This podcast is meant to encourage you to connect within so you can share your light with the world. And now, here's your host, Harrison Ma.
Welcome, powerful, mystical, beautiful beings, to another episode of the Cosmic Love Antenna. This is your weekly installment of your inner connection to your outer expression, where I, your host Harrison, here with the beautiful guests I get to bring on, set the intention of pulling back the layers, restricting health, alignment, and love. And today, as always, here on the show, I have a powerful guest, today a powerful man to share with you. But before I throw to his power, his mystique, just a couple of housekeeping notes as you tune into this episode. If you get a bit of guidance and some insight out of today's show, remember how you can help the show expand and reach more souls who need it is by doing a few things: going over to Apple/Spotify, leaving your reviews and your feedback, sharing this with a beautiful friend or family member that you feel can get some insight and assistance out of these words. And remember now that you can join the Cosmic Love Antenna Facebook group, and I'd love to see you over there. But with all of that, with those foundations of this podcast, I do want to introduce the powerful man I have on the show today. Christian De La Huerta is a coach. He is a TEDx speaker. He is an author. He is a spiritual teacher, and he's a powerful soul in his own right. Today, I'm excited because we're going to go into all things power, divine masculine, what it means to embody this in a very healthy and balanced way, what it means for both the physical male and the physical male to stand soulfully and powerfully in your divine masculine to, create and manifest the world that you deserve. Christian, welcome to the Cosmic Love Antenna.
Hey, Harrison. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
You're welcome, my friend. And we were just having a chat before this podcast, and I didn't mention it to you, but I feel pulled to say it now. And I think we're going to get into this based off the work that you do. But your energy, my friend, is very pleasant. It's very balanced. I can feel that power that you speak of, but I can also feel that feminine flow, that feminine nurturing behind the energy that you put out into the world. Have you been told that before?
Yeah. Thank you. And I feel that way. I feel that balance inside. I guess it's what I call soulful power.
Yeah.
That it is the power of knowing who you are, who one is, who I am, and yet not needing to prove it to anybody. So
yeah.
Also resting in, the capacity to love. So balancing both of those.
I guess, Christian, thank you for answering that. Let's start with that, because that is not an easy thing to do, I think, for a lot of people, myself included. Walking that line, that balance between these two energies, which we're going to hit on a lot today. But I guess where I usually start this show for people listening and tuning in, how did that come to be your reality, right? For example, there's usually, I know in my story and the guests I bring on the show, there's usually a few moments usually, but one that sticks out in your head where it gave you, I call it the pain teacher, it gave you the opportunity to step into this gift, this teaching, this learning that you then share with the world. What pops up around that?
Well, there's been so many moments. There's been such a progression of self-acceptance and then moving into self-love. And coming, by the way, from a place of not that. Like, I know self-doubt, I know self-hatred even during my teenage years. So it's been quite a journey. But the good news is that flash forward to today, and no matter what happens in my life, no matter the details, the circumstances, whether a relationship works out or it doesn't, whether a project succeeds or it fails, in quotes, never, ever do I question my sense of self. It's like that level of self-acceptance and self-love is just completely established and pretty unshakable. I guess if I were going to point to 2 points or two moments or 2 experiences or phases in my life that were instrumental, one was probably my late teens, when I first in love for the first time. And, I was raised in a very Catholic environment, a very Catholic family. And there's a part of me that is still being expressed, just in a different way, that wanted to serve God as I understood it, and wanted to serve the sacred, while I was being told by the religion in which I was raised that I was going to burn in hell for eternity, that I was an abomination in the eyes of God, because I knew that I was gay from a young age. And in fact, I was pretty sexually active as a teenager. But from a very hidden place, in the down low, guilt-ridden, that was the reason for my struggle, for my existential struggle, trying to find a place for myself and trying to reconcile my sexuality and my spirituality. But there was a moment, so I actually went in high school, went ahead and had a meeting with the head of the novitiate, the guy who decided who got in to the Jesuits, because I went to an all-boy Jesuit high school, and who didn't. Thankfully, he was a wise man who said, well, why don't you do a couple of years of college and then we'll talk. And during that time, 3 things happened. I took a class in existentialism and philosophy class, which began a process of questioning the Catholic worldview, which is pretty much all I knew. Then I had a phase of experimentation with mind-expanding substances, which accelerated and deepened that process of questioning, but now like reality as I know it. And then I fell in love. And like I said, I'd had a lot of sex, but this time it was combined with love. It was merged.
Christian,
and I'll never forget. Go ahead. Can
I jump in here? So I'm just listening to your story, and I'm just, 1, it's beautiful, but 2, this whole time I'm getting these hits around, and I want to get your perspective on this and see how this resonates with you. That situation of being born in this lifetime anyway as a gay man that has this beautiful sexual preference towards, who you love and who you decide to love, and also at the same time being within this family dynamic of within the Catholic Church, which people listening to this podcast, you don't need to hear me repeat just how, I think there are beautiful, loving, mystical elements of every single religion, but there are a lot of man-made elements on top of those mystical elements that lead to a lot of separation, trauma, and abuse. And I'm listening to your story, my friend, and I'm thinking, this is not a coincidence. This is, especially when I look at the work that you do now in the world that we're going to get to. I'm wondering, my friend, if you've reflected on this, because I teach a lot about ancestral healing, past lives, predetermined planning in the life between lives before our soul comes into this incarnation. How do you reflect on this? Do you think there was some sort of, if you want to call it God or universe or push behind your soul coming in to that made this environment the way it is so you could be the person you are now?
Yeah, well, let me finish this story, because so what, after the first kiss, like who turned out to be my first lover, at that moment I knew, like in every cell and every part of my body, that being gay was so beautiful, that it couldn't be wrong, that it couldn't be sinful, that it couldn't be an illness, that it couldn't be an illness.
How old were you, Christian, when you were having
this? 18, 19.
Yep.
18, 19, yeah. And so that was one of those that was probably the first really important moment on that journey to self-acceptance and self-love. And from that moment on, there wasn't a priest or a minister or a rabbi or an imam or a psychiatrist that could tell me otherwise. I knew in my deepest self. In terms of your question now, I believe intellectually, I don't have any proof of it, but I do believe it, that we come in with certain intentions, call it karma, whatever, certain experience, call it whatever you want to call it. But I don't know about that for sure. What I do know is that those experiences, all those experiences, that entire experience of my depression, adolescence, that, like, I wouldn't want to go through it again, but I'm glad for it. I'm grateful for it, because I am who I am because of that. It deepened me. It forced me to ask some profound existential questions at a very young age. And it also gave me the ability to empathize, to understand somebody else's pain. Like, I don't have to know the details. I don't have to share those details of what caused those pains, but I know pain. I know existential pain, and I know how to heal it and how to get out of it.
Yeah. It's so beautiful, my powerful friend. And one thing bubbles up in me that I just want to make sure people hear. I think there's a difference between intellectually knowing and soulfully, spiritually knowing, right? And I think what you described about with that first kiss, and then also your reflections on this, I want people to hear that just because there's no intellectual knowing within inside of you doesn't mean that other knowing can't take its place, right? I think we live in a very, and maybe you have experienced it with this, my friend, we live in a very intellectually orientated world where our mind and our thoughts and our belief systems, such as the ones in the Catholic Church, they sort of take center stage. And if there's anything that opposes those thoughts or belief systems, especially within inside of us, we think innately we must be wrong because those belief systems, those thoughts are number one. But we forget that we are feeling, intuiting, and sensing beings as well. Does that resonate, my friend?
Completely. I mean, that's how I live. And that's how I reference my truth is not so much intellectually in terms of thoughts, because there's so much conditioning that goes with that. But it's by accessing that truth that's inside each one of us. And all it takes is the choice to do so, and a little bit of self-discipline to quiet that crazy ego mind, the monkey mind that drives us insane, and to access the deeper, quieter, simpler truth that are inside each and every one of us.
Yeah. And just so people keeping up, one of the ways that we do access these truths is through this masculine and feminine divine balance within inside of us. So let's get into that now, my powerful friend. I think we're a good place to start with this, and we've already been hitting on it to a degree. Define for me what you mean by soulful power. What does that mean? And we'll go deep from there.
All right, so I'm gonna have to back up a little bit to get to that, because we talk about power first, because most of us have an ambivalent, and I would even say conflicted, relationship to power. Part of us wants it, part of us is afraid of it, and I think what we fear, Harrison, is that if we really stepped into our power, that if we really be all of who we are, that other people wouldn't be able to handle it, and that we might end up rejected and alone. And who wants that? I think we also fear that we might abuse power, and no wonder. All we got to do is turn on the news any given day or glance through the headlines online to witness at least one abuse of power. And then on top of that, we've been conditioned to believe that power is a bad thing, with the negative thing, with quotes like "power corrupts," and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And who wants to be corrupted? So what they didn't tell us, though, is that Lord Acton, who spoke those words, was speaking specifically about political power, not the personal power that you and I are talking about.
Big difference.
So The big difference. And so what happens is when you combine to that, when you add to that mix, the fact that we've also been conditioned to be afraid of the emotions, we've labeled the emotions weakness, especially as men. Little boys don't cry. So that's been really driven into us. And many faulty assumptions about that. Why don't little boys cry? Because only little girls cry? And because that's weakness? Yeah. So, a lot of assumptions about that are not true, like the feminine being weakness, or the emotions being weakness. Emotions are just neutral. They're just energy like everything else in creation. So what happens when we put all that into the mix is that we end up giving away our power. We end up saying yes when inside we feel no. We end up settling for less. We end up, because we don't want to rock the boat, because we fear, we settle for an illusion of security, for a false sense of acceptance, and for crumbs of pseudo love. And so what the book talks about is, how do we step into power in a way that's not about hierarchy, control, fear, force, domination, manipulation? How do we step into power in a way that is congruent, that is a match with who we are, that doesn't require that we push anybody down, step on them, put our knee to their neck in order for us to feel powerful? Which then brings us to the conversation about the different types of power, because that's
Christian, let me jump in there, because there's already so much, bubbling up around this, because it's so important for people to hear. I want to get to those different types of power, and we'll break that down in a second, but I want to take a step back to some of these limiting beliefs around power, because that in itself, a lot of people that listen to the show that have heard me speak before about this, the first step in healing, especially from a mental and emotional perspective, is bringing the unconscious to the conscious awareness, right? Bringing these unconscious programs, many of those that you just outlined, that being too much in that power as a man is, about being forceful and being dominant, or being too little is weak, all these things around boys and girls. The first step here is bringing conscious awareness to it, because if we're not bringing conscious awareness, it doesn't mean it's not there. It also means that there's probably something playing in the unconscious that's projecting into the outside world and getting our attention through our relationships, through our dynamic with money, through our body, keeping score physically. So just before we get to the different types of power, my friend, I really want to highlight these limiting beliefs, right? So maybe give me a couple more in your experience. So you get the two ones that you gave were that fear can be too much. I mean, power can be dominant and too much. That little boys, little girls, right? If a girl is embodying her power, then she's not being feminine, she's being too manly. What are some others that you've noticed in your experience that sort of limit the expression of this?
God, there's so many. And you're totally right about these subconscious drivers, because just because we're not aware of something doesn't mean because we're trying to numb it out or run away from it, doesn't mean that it goes away. It's still having an impact on running us and having an effect on our relationships and all of our lives from the subconscious. And so no wonder that Carl Jung, the psychologist, said that the process of enlightenment is having the unconscious become conscious.
Yes.
So there's so many of these subconscious beliefs that we're not even aware of, that we're not good enough, that there's something wrong with us, that we're too much of this, not enough of that, not worthy, not lovable. Just stuff that none of it is real. Right? They're just misunderstandings of young minds that didn't know any better. So for example, like so many people whose parents, the relationship didn't work out and they separated, they divorced. But to those young minds who don't understand, the complexity of human relationships, or sexuality, or how their parents were taught about relationships, and their parents before them, they didn't know what was going on in either of their minds in terms of brain biochemistry, substances, anything like that. All they know is that mommy left or daddy left. Right. And so then we personalize it. We make it about us. It's like, wow, didn't mommy love me? Doesn't daddy love me? How could they leave me? And it had nothing to do with us. It was, it was about the relationship, which we understand now from current perspective. But then the deeper one is like, what does it mean about me that mommy or daddy doesn't love me?
The story.
And that's where we get into trouble. Right. That's where we reach these conclusions that, again, are not true. like there's something wrong with me, that kind of stuff. And then those they're so intense, especially to a young mind, that we can't deal with it. So then we suppress it and we drive it into the subconscious. But again, that stuff doesn't go away. What used to be spiritual teaching, that everything is energy, now we know from quantum physics that it's true. That includes our bodies, it includes the emotions, it includes everything, even if it might feel solid, it's not. It's just vibration, it's energy. So are the emotions. So all those beliefs and those emotions that there's something wrong with us, or that we're not worthy enough, they don't go away. They only fester under the surface, and they get bigger and they get worse. And they're still having an impact on every single one of our relationships since that time.
Our body.
And so, go ahead.
Just to jump in, Christian. So, because you're dropping all the gems here, and again, for people that listen to the show, I hope you're noticing a theme, because I've talked about this before, and because it's so important with what you're saying. We are holistic beings, right? So if something is not being expressed, like you beautifully just highlighted, through the emotional and mental world, it's going to get our attention in another way, right? In our physical world, right? It's physical dis-ease, right? But also what you spoke of, I just want to hit on the inner child element of this, right? And when we experience a trauma, so let's maybe use your example, my friend, of growing up. Let's say I grew up in a religious household, and based off my sexual identity that I deserve to express with the world, my religion, my culture, my family, my friends, they project onto me that it is not worthy, that I'm not enough, that should feel shameful, should feel guilty because of this choice. What I want people to hear is that in itself is traumatic, right? Them projecting their beliefs onto me and the feelings and emotions that are created for it, that's traumatic. But what is lasting, as you highlighted here, is the story that we told ourselves about the event, right? Is I am not worthy because of this, of what I am. I should feel rejected because of this, because of how they are seeing me. I should abandon myself because of this innate truth and power that is moving through me. So speaking of that, Christian, let's go back to the types of power here, but I want to just put this in people's minds as Christian is talking further about this. What is bubbling up for you, right? Because your unconscious, subconscious is active right now, right? So even in this conversation, you're probably getting stimulated. So use this as an opportunity to expand, right?
Yeah. And let's highlight, in case somebody is getting triggered, let's highlight that all that stuff can be healed.
Yeah.
Without a doubt, like not only from my personal experience, but from having facilitated that healing for thousands of people through in the last 30 years that I've been doing transformational work and breath work.
Yeah. And breath work, I mean, that's a whole other conversation we get into, my friend. But let's go back, because I want to hear about, so you were mentioning before about the different kinds of power, the types of power. So let's go into that. I would love to hear.
Good tracking, by the way.
Yeah, I got you.
So I think that's one of the first steps in clearing our relationship with powers, realizing that there are different types. So I think of worldly power, or I also call it ego power. So it's the way that the world relates to power. So, and what is that? Most of us relate power to people who have money, who are famous, who are high up in some kind of hierarchy, whether it's the corporate ladder or some religious institution or something. But because all those expressions of power are external, they're outside of us, they're fickle, right? They're here today, gone tomorrow. Like so many people whose companies, went belly up during the pandemic, and their identities were so connected to those jobs. So, and then, it's not a bad thing. Now they're having to reinvent themselves and rediscover who they are. And so the other kind of, so worldly power always has an agenda. It's always trying to get something for itself, is always trying to prove how big or how powerful or how rich or how fill in the blank it is. And it's hierarchical. It's about power over. So that's how it gets what it wants is it's by exerting force or manipulation and it has a very limited perception about power. It believes that it's zero sum, so that there's only a limited amount, so that your having power takes away from mine, which is another assumption. It's like, wait a minute, if I'm in my power, why would I be threatened by your being in your power? It's like, I know who I am. I know that I can handle whatever comes my way. So why would I be threatened by another powerful person? So in contrast, what I call spiritual power or soulful power, it's that deep power that's inside each and every one of us. Nobody can give it to us. Nobody can take it away. And it's humble. It has nothing to prove to anybody. It knows what it is, and it knows who we are. And so, for example, I think of a Gandhi or a Gandalf in their simple monastic robes, their sandaled feet. You would never know how much power they hold until it's needed, until it's necessary. Then get out of the way. Gandhi brought the British Empire to its knees when it was at its highest point in terms of global reach, without ever shooting a single gun or landing a single punch. Talk about power.
Yeah. So I love these distinctions that you've made. And what really resonates with me, and I'll see if this connects in with this, my friend, see if it connects to your, eloquent explanation of these two distinctions. Something I teach a lot about the chakra system, and I speak about something called righteous anger. And it sounds very similar to the spiritual soulful power that you're talking about. And how I define it is the anger emotion, like you beautifully talked about before, is not good or bad, but there is unbalanced states of it, right? Either the suppressed version of anger, when we hold it in and it causes liver challenges, gut challenge, all the things. The other side of the coin, where we take that anger out as rage on another person, right? We direct it towards someone and put the blame on them. But there is a medium ground of anger where we can channel that anger as the boat in which our love and truth flows through, right? So I think about, you gave the example of the pandemic. I think about over the last 2 years, all of the events that have been happening in the world, they've made me feel angry. But then as I've balanced that anger has allowed me to speak about topics that are important to me, has allowed me to speak up for people that might have needed to have a voice that didn't at that time. So this is an example of righteous anger. Do you connect, first of all, do you resonate with this, my friend? But do you connect this to your soulful power that you're talking about?
Totally. So it goes back to what we're saying about the emotions. Emotions are neither good nor bad. They're just neutral. It's how we express them. Depending on how we express them, they have a good or a not so good effect. So we have a total right to feel angry. It's just an emotion. And you're right. We get into trouble with the emotions, but we suppress them. So if we suppress anger, it turns into rage. If we suppress sadness, it turns into depression. It kind of congeals, it freezes, and it turns into depression. So that's why it's so important that we learn how to feel and give ourselves permission to feel and to have our emotions rather than being had by them, because that's what happens when we suppress them. They have their way with us. Right? They turn up like you're so brilliantly pointing to. They either turn into physical symptoms, or they cause harm to our relationships because we suppress, and then the next unfortunate one says the wrong thing, and boom, we explode in disproportionately to that particular situation because we've been sitting on that volcano of rage for so long, and that was it. That was just the last straw. So we cause harm, sometimes irreparably, to our relationships. And so for me, we've been so conditioned to think of the emotions as weakness. To me, it's actually the opposite. To develop emotional intelligence, to be aware of what we're feeling, and then to learn how to communicate those courageously, because it always takes courage, compassionately, like taking the other person into account, not just having a tantrum like a 2-year-old and throwing all of our emotions on them, on their lap. And gracefully, meaning in a way that they can be heard and received. To me, it's nothing less than mastery level stuff.
Yeah.
So the opposite of weakness, and very much it connects to power.
Yeah. So it's beautiful. So, and this needs to be had, this conversation. This is why I wanted to have you on. I know I have a lot of female listeners on this show, and I'm going to get to that in a second here, actually. But I just want to direct this towards the men listening, is that I know in my experience, and it sounds like in your story when you're talking about your upbringing and that beautiful kiss that you had and the dynamic with your relationship, there is so much explanation and expansion within ourselves when we fully just allow ourselves to understand that we are emotional beings, we are sensitive beings, we are vulnerable beings, that when we express our emotions, not only are we never being too much, especially if we're balanced and we don't suppress things, but we're actually being more of what we are. When we channel into our emotions and allow them to move through us in the ways that they need to move through us in the moment, then we're being all that we are, right? Because we're not blocking, we're not ignoring, we're not suppressing. We're being in the moment with what needs to be expressed in the moment, right? And that's usually an emotional state.
Yeah, and the important thing to remember too is that we can't suppress our emotions selectively. So if we're going around like most of us are, suppressing either anger because we're afraid of it, or suppressing sadness because we don't want to feel it, that stuff doesn't go away, right? That we're also suppressing our capacity to feel joy.
Yeah.
And so it's really important that we learn, like we become like for me, if you would have asked me 30 years ago, and by the way, my dad was a psychiatrist who was also clueless about his own emotions. He was a great psychiatrist because I know people who used to work with him and whom he really helped, but with his own emotions, clueless. And if you would have asked me 30 years ago what I was feeling, I had no idea. No idea. So there are ways, there are practices that we can do to increase our emotional intelligence, which is great news, because there's not much we can do about our IQ. We can become more educated and more knowledgeable, but IQ is pretty constant. And I know there's a lot of variance and flaws about how we measure that. But the good news about EQ, or emotional intelligence, is that we can definitely become much more emotionally intelligent, and that there's really no end to that.
Yeah, I think that's power in itself, right? That just, I get a lot of visuals when you explain these sort of things, and I just got a beating heart as you're explaining that emotional EQ. I know for me as well, it's just, I don't see an end to it, just in terms of, and I think this adds in a mystical, spiritual view, right? The spiritual journey that is very connected, if not intrinsic, to what we've been talking about thus far. There is no end, right? So I think that's a big part of why EQ is everlasting, because it is connected to the spiritual journey, and the spiritual journey doesn't have a destination, right? So there is always going to be this raising of consciousness if we allow it. My friend, I want to change the direction here a little bit now, because I want to bring in the women into this chat, because I think we've been directing it, mostly towards men thus far, but this isn't just a male conversation. This is a feminine conversation too. And I want to ask a question. I posed this to you in our pre-chat, and I want to see what comes up now. I think just to set the sort of foundation for this, when we start talking about the divine masculine and the divine feminine, I think people get confused with the physical male and the physical female. And despite our anatomy, each and every single one of us has these two forces inside of us, this divine feminine and this divine masculine, that we must ask ourselves, how do we balance? My question for you, my friend, is within the physical female body, if there is females listening to this episode, is there a difference between how this soulful power that you've been talking about, or the divine masculine, should be expressed, right? Is there something to be mindful for that is different, in your opinion?
Well, let me back up a little bit and talk about the masculine and the feminine, because I think, the book is for everybody. We all struggle with issues around power, but it has a particular message around women's empowerment. And that's because I believe that the empowerment of women is the single most important thing that needs to happen in the world. It's not to idealize women. It's not to put women up on a pedestal. Women also abuse power. But as a world, as a species, we've been very off kilter, incredibly off balance between the masculine and feminine energies that, as you say, course through everything, through all of creation, because much to the surprise of some humans, we're part of the cosmos. So guess what? Those balanced energies go through all of us in the same way that they go through all of creation. We only get into trouble with them because we suppress the feminine. We've turned the feminine into something lesser, something weaker, which it absolutely is not. If you want to talk power, you want to talk resilience, courage, let's talk about the power of creation that resides in a female body. And there's a really funny story that, I don't know if it's true, but I read somewhere that Betty White, the comedian who passed a few months ago, the story goes something like she was in one of those group celebrity interviews and somebody said something about having balls. And she goes, wait a minute, where do we get this connection between courage and strength and having balls? Because you thump those little things and that guy collapses. He bends over in severe pain. You want to talk courage? You want to talk strength? Let's talk vaginas. Those things take a pounding. So my belief is that when women are in 50% of power, because we don't want to go back to a matriarchal system, what we need is balance, both in the world, and it has to begin within each one of us. And so when women are in 50% of power in this world, I believe we're going to have a very different relationship to war and poverty and hunger, how we treat the environment, education, social justice, etc., to all of it. And so for me, that is a strategic thing. What is the one thing that we could focus on that will then impact all the challenges that we're facing as a world, as a species? And that's what I land on. And I added a chapter specifically for men. What does it mean to be a man in the 21st century? Because we can't leave men behind. And so
let me jump in there, because
jump in.
This is, I love the Betty White story, by the way, and I've heard that. I think I've heard it as you're sharing, as I've heard that before, and it's it's very humorous, but it's also, there's some really fundamental truths here. And two things bubbled up as you were speaking. You said that we don't want to head to a patriarchal society, a matriarchal society. And I think a lot of people hearing that were like, whoa, I thought, isn't that what we want? We want to rebalance by having matriarchal. And in the short term, I think it would be powerful and beautiful and it would do a lot of good. But in the long term, it would do the same thing as being in a long-term patriarchal society, right? There needs to be balance between these two forces that are within inside of us. So instead of going all the way to the extreme and then waiting for the end to hit, let's just start with the balance. Let's start with both sides equally expressed. And it also shows, and this is for men listening now, going back to the physical male, when we suppress the physical female, that is a reflection of us suppressing our inner feminine, right? So I think a lot of the men in the world, probably unconsciously, is my assertion, they suppress the feminine energy or the physical female, but they unintentionally in that act don't realize that by them making that choice, that is a reflection of their internal state, right? If I am a physical male that is telling the physical female in my world to shut up, that your voice does not matter, that your expression does not matter, that you should be suppressed, that is me also telling my inner feminine that it does not have a place to sit as well. So I want everyone to hear that everything is a reflection. Does that make sense, my friend?
Absolutely. And let's talk about the price that we pay for that.
Yeah.
Because without minimizing, the oppression of women over the last several thousand years of patriarchy, which is still running rampant in this world. We're not nowhere near close to being 50-50 in terms of the balance of power between the masculine and the feminine. But men also pay a price for that. So let's look at a couple of statistics. In the US, where I'm based, women outlive men by 5 years, globally by 7 years. And I don't have the suicide rates globally, but in the US, men commit suicide 4 times as frequently as women do. And in fact, 70% of the suicides in the US are committed by middle-aged white men, which is a group that is still the group that holds the majority of the power disproportionately in the world. And we would think, well, it's the group that has the most privileges, that they should live longer, but they don't. So what's going on with that, and what helps to understand that rate of suicide thing? And I think it's connected to what we were talking about before, that we've got this mistaken misunderstanding of what it means to be a man. And so we walk around thinking like these uncaring, unfeeling robots, because if we allow ourselves to feel anything, then that means we're feminine. And no, it's scary. That's weakness. No, we can't do that. But there's a price to pay for that, as we were talking about before. And those suppressed emotions have to come out. Yeah. And if they don't come out disproportionately, like rage and causing harm, like we were talking about, the only other way they come out is showing up as bodily symptoms, cancer, heart attacks, ulcer. And I think that's the part that's related to the longevity issue. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if people haven't, if beautiful listeners out there in the podcast will haven't picked up thus far, these two forces that we're speaking about here are in everything. Then this is not a political conversation. This is not a sexual conversation. This is not a health conversation. This encompasses everything that we see with our eyes, right? This is everything and this is interesting because this is actually where I want to go next, my friend. You set this up beautifully. I want to view this now through another lens in which this applies to is sort of the manifestation, is law of attraction and manifesting the things that we want. And, whether it be wealth, whether it be a partner, whether it be health. This is a pet peeve that I have. And I want to get your perspective on this because I think this slots in perfectly to this divine masculine element here. The law of attraction, which I very much subscribe to, I would call it the law of resonance, but it's the same thing. Like attracts like. We attract what we are visualizing, manifesting, and want to bring about in this reality. A lot of people stop halfway. They connect into the feminine side of it, which is the creation, the flowing, the images, the connecting to the quantum field of it all and the consciousness of it all, and see the thing before it's a physical reality. But then what they forget to do is take the inspired action, take the masculine action of dancing back with the universe that we are co-creating with, right? So it's one thing for us to visualize. It's a whole other thing once we visualize and God, universe, source gives us a tip or gives us a element to move with, we then don't take the inspired action or the powerful action to do so. Does this resonate with you, my friend?
Oh, at so many levels, because it also connects back to the emotions, right? In the way that they teach us to manifest and to bring it about is the more that we involve the emotions, the more that when we visualize what it is that we're trying to bring in out of the world of possibility into this world of third dimensional reality, the most effective way that we can do it to do is to bring in the emotions. So say that, I don't know, what you want is a convertible. So then we would imagine ourselves driving that convertible, and we involve the senses. So we feel the breeze in our hair blowing in the wind, and then intentionally evoke those emotions, like the sense of freedom, the joy, the happiness when we're driving our convertible, with the ocean, near the ocean or over the mountaintop or whatever. And you're right. That part of that process involves the action step. Not just the only way we're going to bring something in out of that world of possibility is by taking concrete action in this world of form. And that, I agree with you, it feels more like the masculine function to me.
Yeah. And that would go back to your points before. I think a lot of us aren't taking that action because there's still limiting beliefs around what that action means, right? So I'm not going to take the action to with the convertible in your example, because there's still a part of me inside that feels unworthy, that I don't deserve said abundance, that I feel unworthy, that I don't deserve that beautiful relationship, that I feel unworthy, that I don't deserve to be the abundant being that in actual reality I am all the time. Right.
That's
so
right.
It's those limiting beliefs we need to start moving through.
That's right. That's part of the conditioning.
Yeah. So my powerful friend, I'm really enjoying this chat, and I think your energy and what you do in the world is so needed. And I want to take this. I've one final question for you before we finish, but I want to get to one more piece before that. And I want to go a little bit deeper here, if we haven't gone deep enough already. And I want to pass this by you to see how this feels for you and see what comes up. One of my mentors teaches around the idea that what we are is expressions of love, right? So God, source, divine, Allah, whatever your name is for that higher power, the thing that they all have in common is that they are made of love. And we are expressions of that oneness. We are made of love. And what we're here to do is for love to experience itself. So me and you right now, we're making love together because we're having an experience of experiencing each other.
Sure.
What love is defined as is the flow of energy and information, right? As you pointed out before, we live in a universe where everything is energy. So love is the flow of energy and information. The flow is the divine feminine, right? The flow is the creative element, the expansive element that we tap into. The information is the masculine, right? So the formation, the structure, the power that the flow of the feminine can move through and feel safe within. So how we experience love in this moment is by having both equal amounts of flow and equal amounts of information. Does that resonate with you, my friend? What comes up around that?
I hadn't thought about it that way, but I can go with that. And what's clear to me, Harrison, is that you and I would not run out of stuff to talk about. And I really enjoyed the back and forth as well. The only thing that I would just want to clarify and make sure that we also throw in there is that the feminine is also powerful. That even though we tend to associate the feminine, and I certainly experience it as, the more sensual and, the more sensual part of the more flowy part of it. But if we want to talk power, as I think of Kali, the Hindu goddess who was like fearsome. She's like the most powerful, like the story about Kali, the reason she's portrayed with her tongue hanging out is because all the male gods were in this battle with demons. And every time they slew one of the demons and a drop of blood would hit the ground, another demon would burst forth. And so they were losing the battle. So they had to summon Kali, who with her tongue would scoop the drop of blood before it hit the ground. And so they were able to defeat the demons then. So I also want to include that in addition to the beautiful, creative, that the feminine can also be incredibly powerful. Yeah. And it is the power of creation. And that the masculine can also be very nurturing.
Yeah.
So that's part of what I get into in that chapter is redefining, updating these archetypal traditional male roles for the 21st century. So for example, part of the reason that so many men are struggling is because women are getting empowered. So like in the US, more than half of college graduates are women. And in a few years ago, I think it was 2017, the numbers are in the book. But out of in heterosexual households in the US, 40%, in 40% of those heterosexual households, women are earning more than the men. And at the same time that all these jobs that men traditionally fulfilled are being outsourced or replaced by robotics and computers. And so a lot of men are understandably, and my heart goes out to them, going through this identity crisis. Well, who am I if I'm not the provider? But what a limited way of thinking about yourself as a man. Like, is really, are we going to define our masculinity by the size of our paycheck? And so then what I say is like, all right, well, is that the only way that we can be providers? Or what about providing a safe environment? What about being a rock in your household, in your family, so that your loved ones can feel free to grow, to expand, to experiment with different ways of being, exploring what life is about, knowing that dad, that father figure has their back. And what a beautiful way of providing. And like that, I look at different ways, like exploring and the conqueror, and redefine them for the 21st century.
I think if any female, but specifically males listening to this chat today, takes anything away from it, it's what you just said, my friend. It's feel free. And I'll give an example here. I get a lot of females who message me on this podcast saying they felt a certain way based off some of the things that we said and I talked about, or the guest talked about. And I think that's powerful, but I would encourage the men to do the same too, right? It goes to what you're saying. We need to be able to move beyond not just the archetypes, not just the beliefs, but everything that is outside of us that's telling us how we should or shouldn't be, right? There is a voice, there is an energy, there is a force, whether it's the feminine, whether it's the masculine, whether it's love, whether it's God, inside of you that is speaking, right? And your first job is to listen, right? Is to move beyond all the external elements that you were just speaking of, my friend, and have an open conversation with yourself and take a step from there, right? What does that look like beyond the parameters, right? Beyond the conditioning, beyond the government, beyond the culture, beyond the religion, beyond the family, the friends. What does that pure expression of you look like? And if it is fitting into the powerful masculine role or the feminine powerful role or whatever we've talked about today, if it's coming from you, it's correct, right? And from there, we can add the layers on top that we wish.
Yes. Preach, brother, preach.
My friend, I have one more final question for you, but before I get to that, if the beautiful souls that have tuned into this conversation thus far have connected to the work that you're doing, the expression that you've shared around this powerful, soulful power, what can people do? I know you have your beautiful book that you're promoting. You're a coach. What do you want to offer my audience?
Well, yeah, in terms of how to reach me, in terms of how to find out about the book, Awakening the Soul of Power, you can get it at your local bookstore, or you can order it there, or you can get it on Amazon. In terms of how to reach me, probably my website is the best way to do that. soulfulpower.com, SOULFUL power.com. And anybody who goes to soulfulpower.com and gets on my email list, and we all know how easy it is just to click unsubscribe if it doesn't work for you. And I promise you, I'm not going to take it personally if it doesn't work for you. But anybody who gets on the email list, that we will send them a sample chapter of the book, which talks about what it means to live a heroic life in the 21st century. We'll send them some power practices that are designed to integrate, to apply those teachings to our lives so that they don't stay at the level of information. Because Harrison, you and I know we don't need more information. We've got information overload. What we need is transformation. And that only comes from really living those teachings and applying them to our lives. And then we'll also send them a recorded guided meditation that I did in the midst of the pandemic, which talks about and then guides people into a place of how do we move into a place of trust in these times of fear and chaos and uncertainty.
I love it. As always, beautiful listeners out there in the podcast world, if you go to the show details, if you're listening to Apple or Google or Spotify, you'll see all the links. I'll put it all there in the show notes, and you can just click on them and go straight to those resources. And just speaking to that, needing more things, this transformation journey, I'm sure you agree with this, with the work that you do, my friend. It's less of an adding on, and it's more of a, as we've just been talking about today, pulling back the layers that are restricting the power, the light, the love that's been there the whole time. And it's more and more as I go on this journey myself, that cannot be more true. My beautiful friend, my final question here that I sort of end the show with usually is just to set it up. The show is called The Cosmic Love Antenna. And when I say love, as I expanded on before, love is really, for me, the foundation of reality, right? It is God, it is universe, it is source. And a big part of the show is really helping people redefine their relationship with love. So I'm wondering, sir, and I'm already getting some interesting hits based off your story and your upbringing. How do you define that love word yourself?
Well, I think two ways come to mind. One is what you're saying. I think ultimately, love is what fuels, creation. And we're not talking here like a new agey, namby-pamby sort of love. We're talking love as the most powerful energy love. Creation. Yeah, fierce love. And another definition of love that I love is Scott Peck's from The Road Less Traveled, because we confuse love, the feeling of love, with love, right? And so the way that he defines love is as an act. Because, if we think about it, there are times where love doesn't feel good, right? Think about disciplining a child, or keeping a child, no, you can't run into the middle of a street, for their own good. So it's really an act of love, but it doesn't feel good. Telling a child, no, you can't have more sugar, it's for their own good. So it's an act of love that doesn't feel good. So if it isn't the feeling, then what is it? And then he talks about how love is an act, and he defines it in such a beautiful way. He says that love is when we place ourselves outside of our comfort zone for the sake of the spiritual growth of another being. Like, wow. When we place ourselves outside of our comfort zone for the sake of a spiritual growth of someone else. It's like, wow, what a beautiful way to think about that.
Yeah. I think that's my new favorite, my friend. I try not to have favorites, but I like that. And it really puts a new perspective on fear, right? Because fear is usually the thing that's keeping us in our comfort zone, right? So
exactly.
I don't think it's the opposite, but it shows you now that if I'm feeling fear, then what is going to be beyond that fear is that deeper expansion of love. So
exactly, because you're right. So many of us think that hate is the opposite of fear, but I agree with you. To me, fear is the opposite of love. I mean, hate is not the opposite of love. Fear is the opposite of love.
Yeah, and you could take it deeper here. What does fear usually cause? Fear usually causes separation. Causes separation either with someone else or a part of ourselves. And if we're in love, we're in experience with someone where we're coming closer. So that sounds like a whole other podcast we could do, my friend. But
you and I are just getting started, I think.
I feel it, my friend, and I love you very much. Thank you for spending time with me today. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and guidance with everyone listening. Beautiful podcast listeners out there in the podcast world. Thank you for giving us your ears, your time, your attention today. I hope you got some value. Remember, if you did, share this episode far and wide with people in your world that can take use of this soulful power. But until next time here on the show, we both love you very much and we wish you a wonderful evening, morning, and afternoon. And we'll catch you next time. Bye, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Cosmic Love Antenna podcast. We hope you enjoyed. Be sure to follow Harrison on Instagram, Twitter, and Clubhouse at Harrison Ma. That's Harrison, Meagher.